Hello, welcome. I'm really happy today to have with me esteemed colleague, scholar, author Karl Kapp. He's renowned throughout the industry, and I'm really pleased that he's made the time to join us today and have a little chat about what he's been doing and what he's um, doing in the future. With that, Karl, why don't you introduce yourself?
Andre, yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. This is great. My pleasure. So I'm Karl Kapp. I'm a professor of instructional technology at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I've been there for almost 25 years. It'll be 25 years this summer. And my most well-known work is in the area of games and gamification for learning. So I've written a number of books on the gamification of learning and instruction. Uh, Created a number of games, created some software, game-based software. So I've been very active in my career in studying, understanding, and helping others to understand the design, development, and implementation of both gamification and game-based learning. Oh, and I have some courses on LinkedIn Learning and all kinds of different places and stuff like that. But my passion really is thinking about how games can be best be used for learning and development.
Well, that's fantastic. And actually, Kyle mentioned it. I have him right here. The books. I think that's his latest, Play to Learn. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then we have Gamification Field Book. And of course, the Gamification of Learning and Instruction. All by Carl. So, Carl, tell me what got you into games and using games for education.
Yeah, that's a question. So there's kind of a two-pronged story. So the first prong is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm downstairs playing James Bond 007 Nightfire, one of the best games ever on the PlayStation 2, I think it was. And I'm thinking about how to move my character from point A to point B, James Bond. And I'm noticing that the game is actually teaching me what I need to do to move my character from one place to the other. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. Like, they didn't give me text like, oh, Carl, move your character here. They just kind of gave me things to avoid and consequences for not moving my character the right way. And I'm like, yeah, that's really interesting. They're actually teaching me something as I go through that. And then the other thing was around that time, online poker was becoming like really popular, and so it was televised televised poker, which this is interesting. What revolutionized online poker was the mini camera, so you could see the other people's cards. So as a television viewer, so before you'd watch people play poker, you don't know what they have. So are they really bluffing? Are they not bluffing? You don't know. But once they introduced that camera where you could see the other people's cards on TV, not the other players, but on TV, you knew if that person was bluffing or not. And that totally changed the viewership. But they said there were a bunch of young people who were poker playing at championship levels because they played online poker. So you could play literally hundreds or thousands of online poker games in a weekend where you couldn't do that in the physical world, and those people really gained a lot of knowledge. So I said, hey, well, I'm creating this online instruction for people, and it's as boring as you could get, and yet games are teaching me things and people are learning things. I'm like, why can't we take elements or pieces of games? I didn't have a word for it then, but pieces of games, and make our learning more game like. We don't have to turn it into an entire game, although that'd be awesome. It's expensive and takes a long time to do. So could we add game elements to make the learning more and more effective? And so that's really how I got into it. And so first thing I did then was decide to write a book about that. To really help me, gather my thoughts and everything. And also, there was a lot of people out there saying, there's no research on games. Games aren't good for learning. Nobody knows if they're good for learning, And this was in, the 2000s, late 90s. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure games have been around for quite some time. There's got to be some research out there. So I started looking through the research, and it turns out there's a ton of research on games for learning, going way back to like the 30s and 20s. I mean, way before people, thought about online games. So the idea that there was no research supporting the fact that games were effective for learning just really kind of blew my mind. So that first book, the White Book, is all about the research fundamentals and the research foundation of game-based learning. Yeah. So if you're into the research and you're into the kind of the academic side of it, that's the book that talks about, why is gamification, effective from a research perspective. Then the interesting thing about that book is when I proposed it to the publisher, they didn't want to use the word gamification. They're like, yeah, nobody knows what that word is. You can't use that word. I'm like, well, but so I had to do research. Like, okay, Forbes had an article that said gamification, and Inc. magazine had an article. So can I use gamification? And that's kind of what how that book came to be.
Excellent. It's a great book. Again, there's going to be a link down below directly to the book. I highly recommend it because I've got all three of Karl's books. And I know he's actually written more books, but on the subject of game-based learning. So you've written the first book. It's come out. People read it. What's the feedback been, and how did that shape your journey and your thinking moving forward?
So it's really interesting. So there were a number of people that were like, "This is great. This is what I need to do to keep my instruction going. I really like the idea." There's a lot of people going, I don't get it. I don't get it. What are we talking about? Gamification? I don't understand it." And then there were people that were like vehemently anti gamification. And so the really interesting thing, there was a group of people that were serious game developers, and they were like, "How dare anyone else come into the fiefdom of game developers? No one else can do this but us. You have no idea what you're talking about." So that was really kind of an interesting backlash. There's all kinds of articles about gamification isn't really good, and it's being used for evil purposes, and shouldn't be good. So that was kind of really interesting. And then again, but the interesting thing again, gamification has been used for centuries, right? So it wasn't called gamification, but you go back to the green stamps in the United States when you went to the gas station, you would get stamps, you would turn those in and you would get prizes or rewards. You would see gamified contests for marketing. I mean, all kinds of use in school, everywhere. So it wasn't this brand new thing that nobody ever thought of. It just came under this umbrella of gamification. And so the first number of years, but I was young and I had no idea, so I just kept moving forward. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of cool to me, so I'm just going to do it. But many of the years was like, what is it? How does it work? I don't understand it. So spent a lot of time educating people about what it was and how it worked and the concepts. Now, fast forward maybe 10, 15 years later, people are starting to go, okay, I get it. How do I do it correctly? How do I do it the right way? So now I spend a lot of time talking about, okay, well, here's how you implement it correctly. Here's how it can work. And, spend some time separating games and gamification. So gamification is the use of pieces of games, parts of games, really the psychological elements of games that make us want to play them or continue to play them. And a game is kind of a self-contained instructional unit. Both are very effective from a learning perspective when done correctly. And both have their place. Sometimes you can't play a full-fledged learning game. Sometimes gamification works, or sometimes you want to get into deeper, non-linear, visceral thinking, and a game-based environment is really, really good for that. So it just depends on what your learning goals are. Games are not panaceas, but neither are lectures and neither are discussions. And so, I find it very fascinating when people say, well, I'm not going to change everything to games. I said, yeah, but you're doing everything by lecture? You think everybody learns from no. There has to be a mix. And research shows that active learning, which comes from game playing, is really a good way to learn and really a good way to recall information. The one thing that games do is they have this concept of desirable difficulty, which basically says that even a little bit of struggle in coding information into our brain makes it easier to recall later on. and how schools typically do instruction, and organizations even, but mostly schools, is we give you the information and we try to make it easy for you to learn. Here's some notes for the test. Here's what's going to be on the test. Here's all that kind of stuff. So people cram that as easily as possible. They give themselves flashcards or whatever. They take the test, do awesome. 3 weeks later, they don't remember a word from the test, right? Because it was all easily encoded, easily spit out because of recency, but not memorable at all. But think about, I always say this to people, think about the last time you played a game and you were stuck on a level, right? And you couldn't get past the level, and then you figured it out. I bet you remember that even to this day, getting past that really difficult level. Most people say, well, yeah, of course, because I had to figure it out. Or, I remember playing a game and sleep and having dreams about how to get to the next level, right? Because your mind's working on these problems. And that's kind of, I think, one of the really exciting things about games and how they work from a learning perspective.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I'm glad you mentioned the difference between gamification and games, game-based learning. There's a video we have for anybody interested in learning more about that. Now, as you encountered folks that are not excited about games or gamification, and but there's the other ones, teachers, educators that really want to embrace games or gamification. How do you help them? What do you suggest? Where do they start? Even looking, besides reading your books, what's your recommendation?
Right, that's a great question. So first of all, it's funny when I work with corporate people and I work with education people. Most of the time, the educational people are much more open to games and they get it much more quickly because they're managing a classroom, they're helping students. So they come up with games. I think much more. It's much more facile for them to do it. But even then, there's some barriers to adoption. So one of the things that I ran into early on is we created a game for the National Science Foundation, and we tried to do it in a school lab, and the school lab was shut down. Like Fort Knox was probably easier to break into than putting software onto that school's lab. So that was kind of crazy. So you got to be friends with the IT department. The next thing is I say to anyone who's thinking about using games for learning is to, first of all, start off by playing a lot of learning games to get comfortable with how games work, how they flow, how people react to games, what people think about games. So that's a good place to get started. The other thing is to try it out for yourself. So take whatever game that you're thinking about implementing into the classroom and play it for yourself to see how it works, how it can be integrated into your curriculum, what kind of decisions that you need to make in order to do the game. There's research that shows one of the best ways for learning to come from a game is to kind of set up the game. Hey, this is what you're going to be playing. This is what I want you to think about when you play the game. Then have them play the game and then do a debrief. You need to have that 3-step process to help somebody understand what's about to happen, then experience it, but then reflect upon it. It's really important to reflect upon your learning from the learning perspective. And so that 3-part process does that. So the other thing is to get with like-minded teachers who are interested in games for learning. Like I said, there's a bunch of them, and work on that. So there's lots of ways. And then finally, I say to people is it doesn't have to be technology based. A lot of times we think, oh, games have to be technology, but card games were invented like in 960 BC, like way back when. And the interesting thing, they were invented, they think in China, like nobody knows for sure. They think in China, and they think they were actually scenario-based games on the playing cards, which I find that fascinating. And they were, I wouldn't recommend this for education, but they were drinking games back then. So, like, it's so funny. Humans have always thought, we need a game to drink because we just can't drink alone, right? Something I don't know. But it was so fascinating how they had these scenarios and they had role plays that you had to act out and things like that. So games have been used for role plays and scenarios and for learning for literally thousands of years. So anybody that thinks, oh, this is a newfangled thing and we don't know if this is tried and true is not exactly with it on what's happening with the research and the history of using games for learning.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years. I mean, the ancient Greeks used it to train their military, right?
Yeah.
War games, something common use. A point you just made regarding finding the community, reminder to everybody, we have a Discord server for educators focusing on game-based learning. Please join us with that. And I really like the fact that you mentioned when we think about games and educational games, we don't always want to assume video games or electronic games. I mean, card games, board games can be just as effective. Now, if a teacher says, well, this is all well and good, but I'm not a gamer, I really don't play games, card games or board games, what do I do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So depending on how brave you are, so I mean, students are, as if you point them in the right direction, very enthusiastic, very engaging. So sometimes if I'll have a game, I'll have students who are used to playing games, maybe some genre that I'm not used to, and I'll ask them to be the game master for the day, right? Okay, I want you to help people play this game, and then I'll debrief it and kind of do the observation. The other thing is there are a number of channels on YouTube. Like if you don't know how to play a game, there's a video somewhere that will teach you how to play the game. So you can figure that out. And third is sometimes we think of these games, especially for learning, as these big, sophisticated things, and those can be really helpful. And there's a lot of those out there. But if you want to get started, like in your classroom, just take index cards and put some information on index cards and do trading, right? Trading cards. So it doesn't have to be, and then that can be a gateway to getting to more and more sophisticated elements of learning. The other thing is, oftentimes when I have to teach a subject, I'll have the students develop their own game, because think of how well you have to know a subject or you have to know information in order to create a game out of it. So, and then the cool thing from being a teacher is, at least I teach everything semester after semester, right? Every semester. So if students do like a really awesome game, I say to them, hey, if I give you full credit, can I use this in the future? And most students are like, yeah, that's awesome. You're using my game. So you can actually have students kind of develop games for you as you go to get started. And the other thing is just to read, if you're interested in games, read up on it, understand what they're about, watch them on YouTube, think about the history of learning games. As you had said, it goes back really to preparing for battles. And I have a series on YouTube called the Unofficial, Unauthorized History of Learning Games. And just understanding the history of how games were used for learning and lessons that can be drawn from that can help you understand how better to implement games into a classroom environment.
And you'll find the link to Karl's series right below. So please check it out. I highly recommend it. I again really insightful feedback for our teachers, educators. Now, if I'm not well versed in the language of games, and I really like what you mentioned, I also use it in my classes. I always say the highest form of game-based learning isn't actually using a game, but is when you can get your students to make a game. Because we all know the old principle: oh, if you get somebody to do a presentation on a subject, they really have to immerse themselves in the subject to teach others. Well, it's even more so true when making a game about a subject. So as a physics teacher, chemistry, English, it doesn't matter. You can get your students, hey, you guys make a game on the very subject matter, and you'll be amazed on what the students are doing and how engaged they are with the topic. However, there's a challenge. I may not be as well versed in the different elements, the language of games or gamification. What are some quick tips you could give us? I want to get started with gamification, and I'm a little bit worried that I don't know the right verbiage or the right elements. Should I do a competition? Should I just hand out badges? How do I start practically? What's your recommendation?
Yeah, I like to talk about the concept of game literacy. And basically, what that idea is understanding the terms, the elements, and the aesthetics of games. So, for example, there's a whole thing about game mechanics, which are basically rules of the game. There are game dynamics, which are things like outwitting an opponent, racing to the finish, those kind of things. And then there are aesthetics, which is how's the game look, how's it feel. And so playing lots of different games will give you lots of different experiences, but you can't just play them. You have to think about, okay, when it's not my turn, what am I doing? Or how do people pick up cards or discard cards? Or how do people move around the board? Or how do people win this game? How can I win this game? What are the elements of winning a game? So all of those kind of things build this literacy of how games work. And so when you think about incorporating game for learning and actually designing the game, is you have to be literate first. So play those games, dissect the games. In the book Play to Learn, we have a worksheet. We say be careful because you'll never look at games the same way again. But we have a worksheet where you actually deconstruct a game. You know, what was the learning goal? Was it fun? What were the aesthetics? What were the dynamics? So understanding those elements can be really, really helpful for implementing games. And then, as you said before, Andre, being in a community where people are open to discussing different types of games, how they're using games. You can get ideas from them. There's a place called Board Game Geek online that really breaks every game element you've ever heard of down and explains it, like what's a badge, what's a shredding game, what's a collecting game, what's a strategy game. So you can start to build an understanding of all of the elements that go into games. Just like anything else, games have a language of their own. It's not mysterious, but it's not something that we're typically used to. So when you start to read about games and play games and look at places online, you'll start to, oh, I get that. That's a collecting mechanic. Okay, you know what? That mechanic was also in Trivial Pursuit. And you know what? That same mechanic is part of Go Fish. And then you start to see these broader patterns. And then when you think about games or teaching through games, you can recognize and articulate those patterns to your students and be much more aligned with the learning goals and the game goals and help bring it all together.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that you've got some courses that are available online. Tell us a little bit more about your courses.
So a while ago, I was doing some LinkedIn learning course. Well, started off as lynda.com courses. And the first one is on gamification. And so that course is really designed to give the basics of what is gamification, how does gamification work. There's some case studies in there. And then the next course is the gamification of learning, which kind of says, okay, well, let's look at that. So I've defined 3 different types of gamification. Structural gamification, which is where you put things like a game around the content, but don't change the content at all. Content gamification, which makes the content a little bit more game-like. And then finally, performance-based gamification, where you tie on-the-job performance actually to gamified elements. So for example, if you're an account representative on the phone, and you have to hang up after 30 seconds, you get points if you do that. So that's that course. And then most people don't think about this, and I didn't think about it when I created the course, but then I did a course on sales gamification where I talk about gamifying behaviors. So take out the word sales and just think about that course on gamification, and it talks really about the elements that you should gamify. So a lot of people like to gamify the end, like, oh, let's gamify the highest grade, right? Like whoever gets the highest grade wins. The problem with that is the people that already know how to get the highest grade are already going to get the highest grade. So gamifying that doesn't work. You're just rewarding people because they already know what they're doing. What you should do is say, well, how do you get the highest grade, right? Well, you study every night for 15 minutes. Okay. Gamify that. Give a reward for the people that study every night for 15 minutes. And then you're going to start building the behavior that you want. So the idea behind gamification really is not to gamify the end result. getting the highest grade or scoring the best on the test. It's to gamify the process. So an example, I had a history professor, no, teacher in I think it was high school, and he gamified it really interestingly. He would say that if you got an A on all of your uh, tests, you wouldn't have to take the final and you get an A for the class. Well, I view that. I said, well, can you still get an A in the class if you don't get an A on all those tests? He said, well, you would have to ace the final, and no one's ever done that. I said, challenge accepted. So I purposefully gamified that process where I got below the A on every one of those tests, and then at the end took the final test. I don't have any idea what I was thinking or why I did that, but because I would never do that again. But the idea was that was a challenge and something that I wanted to try to accomplish. And so if you set, and that was self-motivated, but if you as an instructor set those kind of goals and set those kind of behaviors where, hey, if you do this behavior and this behavior and this behavior, this will be the result, and be very transparent about it, which is what gamification is about, then that can be a really exciting and interesting thing for students who are motivated in that area. Other students aren't motivated in that area, so you've got to find and gamify what motivates them. So it's not a one size fits all, but there are different elements in it. So, if you look at Bartle players types, some people like to explore, some people like to socialize, some people like to get the highest score, some people like to impede others. So if you take a game that has all of those elements in them, you're going to appeal to a broad range of folks. So if you're thinking about using a game, think about how those elements can appeal to others. And then I have a couple, for educators, I have some courses on how to be a successful professor, how to write a syllabus, how to create engaging learning. But it really comes down to engagement and the elements of, if you're going to look at any of the courses, I think the first one on gamification is really a good primer for anybody who's thinking of adopting it into their classroom or school district.
Oh, that's fabulous. And there's a link down below to all these courses. I really love your comment on the don't gamify the end, don't reward the end. Because you're right. In my opinion, school is already gamified because we're giving out grades, right? A through F or 1 through 5, depending on the system you're in. And you're right, the A students will always do the extra thing. They always go the extra mile, do additional work to be A students. But it's the C and the D students that we want to help, and saying, oh, well, you can get an A. Well, clearly they're not motivated already or aren't able to get there on their own. So I really love that insight. Gamify the behavior that will ultimately lead to that A. I actually done some things similar in my current class, one of my current classes, where I use the principle of fear of loss to see how the dynamics in the classroom changes by giving everybody 100 points at the beginning of the semester. Everybody got an A, and while they can earn more points, it's really easy to lose some points by being late, not turning in your work, not participating, and it really changed the dynamic of the classroom. Versus in the past, I always had, you always have some students that are just not participating or they're constantly late. And here the groups are really watching out for each other. No, we don't want to lose points. We're guaranteed an A if we just keep our points versus having to earn points, right? Not everybody is motivated by, why do I have to earn points? Versus, well, losing something that you already have, that's a very different
It
driver.
is. No, that's a great game element to have in it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I heard you saying something else, groups, which is another game
Yeah.
element that not a lot of people think about. But if you think about, like World of Warcraft and all of those big RPGs or MMORPGs, they have, clans or guilds or teams or gangs or whatever. And they all work together for a single goal, and not one person typically wants to let down the whole group, uh,
Yes.
except Leroy Jenkins. But other than that, um, uh, most of the time people want to work together to accomplish
Yep.
goals. So that's another great gamified element to put into a classroom environment as well.
Well, what I found is you're absolutely right. There is about half of us really like competition, and the other half do not, as humans. And then there's collaboration. So how do you bring that competitive element into a classroom without alienating half of your students? And so it's like, okay, well, you have groups. So within a group, you collaborate, but the groups themselves compete against other groups. And you can take this to depending on, your students and your classes. You'll probably know your students better. Some are more susceptible to that, where like, yes, in my classes, all the students are really highly competitive versus in other classes, they're really not. And so they create a collaborative environment. But as a group, has to watch out for each other. And I had to make a change. I mean, adjustment at the beginning, it was everybody for themselves. If you're late, you lose points. Okay. But then I noticed, okay, well, that doesn't necessarily drive the desired behavior. And so then I tuned it to if one of the group members is late, the whole group loses points. Oh, that really changed things. I mean, that was fabulous to see the students all of a sudden really be concerned and looking out for each other. Hey, are you going to be on time? Right? Versus, well, it's just a bad teacher. I mean, they're kind of now taking care of it themselves. And that was really, really nice to see.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. That's a great example how the right. So that's a great example. One, you don't need technology to gamify. Two is that adding the right or tweaking on dynamic that you're experimenting with can make all the difference. And three, how the social element of gamification can really be helpful as well. So yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful example.
Thank you. Now, before we wrap up, what's last words of wisdom you may want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, so I think what I think game-based learning is a really effective tool for thinking in a nonlinear fashion. So a lot of times when we teach and when we present information, it's very linear. Step one, do this. Step two, etc. But in the world, when we're outside, it's not nonlinear, right? You've got, so for example, you're trying to work from home, and there's a crisis in Ukraine, and it's snowing, so you've got to shovel the driveway, and you've got to get your kids to school. Plus, you've got to have this work assignment. So there's a lot of things that you have to decide how to prioritize. Is there anything that you can do simultaneously? What kind of trade-offs do you want to make? And game-based learning is great for that, right? When you're playing a game, you can think outside the box in terms of your strategies and what you want to accomplish. So I think when you want to teach nonlinear and critical thinking, I think games are a great way to do that. The other piece of advice I always give, and we talked about this already, is to play just a bunch of different games. Play games that you're not comfortable with, that you do like, that you don't like. Play single-player games, multiplayer games, play board games, card games, video games, games on your phone, and keep track of what you like and don't like, what works and what doesn't work. And that's going to help you when you implement games and think about games. And the last thing I'm going to say is we've used in class like a lot of like Settlers of Catan or Catan for a team building game. So you don't have to create your own games. You don't have to buy educational games, although those are really helpful and a lot of advantages. If you happen to have a board game and you've got your kids together, and you can have them play that game and teach something like teamwork or communications or those types of things. So you yourself be creative in how you leverage games in the classroom for learning, and you'll have fun and you'll learn and the students will learn, and it'll be a win-win for everyone.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Karl. I really appreciate you taking the time today to speak to me. And as anticipated, your words are just amazing and really, really helpful. I mean, I personally learned a lot just having a short conversation. And I hope one of these days you will be able to join us on the Discord server one of the live coffee chat sessions, to to interact with our educators. And of course, remember everybody, down below is all the links to the books, to the course, and to Karl's YouTube series. With that, thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.